The city park was quiet in the early evening, the sky beginning to take on shades of deep purple and navy blue as dusk settled in. The faint sound of children playing echoed from a nearby playground, and families enjoyed their evening walks under the glow of the street lamps. In the middle of this calm scene was Athena Dixon, a tall, athletic black woman in her early 40s, with a warm but determined expression that reflected years of resilience. With her was her 10-year-old daughter, Isabella, a lively and curious girl who idolized her mother and hung on her every word. Tonight was a special evening for them both. It was one of those rare days when Athena could leave her worries behind and spend uninterrupted time with Isabella, showing her the basics of skateboarding, a new hobby that Isabella had recently become obsessed with. Athena, who had grown up skateboarding on rougher streets than this, was thrilled to share her skills with her daughter, eager to see her learn the same balance and confidence that had carried Athena through so many challenges in her own life. As Isabella placed her foot on the skateboard and wobbled, Athena laughed and held her arms out, ready to catch her if she fell. "Just keep your knees bent, baby," Athena said, her voice gentle but firm. "And remember, if you lose balance, don't be afraid. Just let yourself fall naturally. I'm here and you'll be fine." Isabella looked up at her mother with wide, trusting eyes and gave a determined nod. For her, this was more than just a lesson in skateboarding. It was a chance to be like her mom, brave, steady, and unafraid. While Athena focused on her daughter, she remained alert, her instincts honed from years of experience in dealing with difficult situations. Her life had not been easy. Raised in a rough neighborhood and having faced countless challenges, Athena had learned to defend herself, both physically and emotionally. She was a fighter by nature, though she rarely showed this side of herself, especially in public. Her past had shaped her into a resilient woman who knew how to stay calm under pressure, a trait she now hoped to pass on to Isabella. But tonight was supposed to be about joy, not survival. She pushed those thoughts aside and focused on Isabella, watching her daughter beam with pride every time she managed to stay balanced on the skateboard a few seconds longer. To Athena, these small moments were precious. They were rare breaks in a life filled with hard work and responsibility. As a single mother, Athena worked tirelessly to provide for her family, and moments like these were her reward, a chance to be present and connect with her daughter in ways that went beyond words. In the distance, however, a figure appeared, moving purposefully toward them. It was Officer Mark Copeland, a middle-aged white police officer with a reputation that was well known around town, but not for reasons he'd want anyone to celebrate. He had served on the force for nearly 2 decades, but those years had left him bitter, hardened by a life he felt had cheated him out of the success he deserved. His frustration had long since twisted into resentment, and his prejudices, once subtle, had become more blatant over time. Mark Copeland had a particularly deep-seated bias against black residents in his jurisdiction. He viewed them with suspicion and disdain, often believing they didn't belong in certain parts of town. His biases had led him to harass numerous innocent people under the guise of protecting the neighborhood. And tonight, seeing Athena and Isabella in what he considered a clean park filled with mostly white families triggered his prejudice. In his mind, Athena was just another black woman who needed to be reminded of her place. As he approached, Athena noticed him out of the corner of her eye. Her body instinctively tensed, but she maintained her outward calm. She didn't want to alarm Isabella, who was still wobbling on her skateboard, oblivious to the officer's approach. Athena had encountered officers like Copeland before, men who saw her skin color as a threat, men who assumed she was trouble without ever knowing her story. She had long since learned to handle these encounters with restraint, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her react. But as the officer's heavy boots crunched closer on the gravel path, Athena's instincts told her that this time might be different. Copeland stopped a few feet away, his stance aggressive and his eyes cold. He looked at Athena and Isabella with a barely concealed sneer, as if their mere presence in the park was an affront. Without any formalities, he barked, "You don't belong here." His voice was loud enough to catch Isabella's attention, and the little girl turned to look at him, confusion in her eyes. Athena took a deep breath, suppressing the surge of anger rising within her. She stepped forward slightly, shielding Isabella with her body. She had no intention of letting this man intimidate her or her daughter, especially on what was supposed to be their night of bonding. "We're just enjoying the park, officer," she said calmly, her voice steady. "It's public property, and we have every right to be here." The officer's eyes narrowed, and he took a step closer, intruding into her personal space. "You think you can just do whatever you want, don't you?" he said, his tone dripping with contempt. "I've seen people like you before causing trouble, thinking you own the place." He barely glanced at Isabella, who had instinctively moved closer to her mother, her small hand gripping Athena's shirt. Isabella was old enough to sense the tension, even if she didn't fully understand it. Athena clenched her jaw, her fists tightening at her sides, but she forced herself to stay calm for Isabella's sake. She looked the officer straight in the eye and said, "I don't know what you think we're doing here, but we're not causing any trouble. My daughter is just learning how to skateboard. That's all." Officer Copeland laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "Oh, I bet. Teaching her how to break rules early, huh? Starting them young, just like the rest of you." His words were sharp, each one a deliberate attempt to provoke. He was pushing, testing to see if he could break the calm exterior she wore so well. Athena felt her control slipping, her anger simmering beneath the surface. But she reminded herself that reacting would only make things worse. She knew men like him thrived on control, on forcing others to submit. But she was not going to let him intimidate her or make her daughter feel unsafe. However, as Athena stood her ground, something in her silence seemed to enrage Officer Copeland further. He wasn't used to people, especially black women, holding their own against him. He took another step forward, towering over her now, and sneered, "Maybe I should teach you a lesson about respect." And with that, he did the unthinkable. In a sudden, unprovoked move, he raised his hand and slapped Athena across the face. The force of the blow made her stumble back a step, and the sharp sting radiated across her cheek. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Isabella gasped, her small voice breaking the silence, and her eyes filled with fear as she looked at her mother, not fully understanding but terrified nonetheless. Athena straightened, her hand instinctively reaching up to touch her cheek. Her face burned with pain, but what hurt more was the humiliation, the blatant show of power and disregard for her humanity. She looked up at Copeland, and in that moment, something shifted. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about Isabella, who was watching everything. It was about every time she'd been told to know her place, and now more than ever she felt the need to show her daughter that no one had the right to treat them this way. Athena took a deep breath, gathering herself. She wasn't going to let fear dictate her actions. She looked the officer dead in the eyes, a cold, unwavering resolve hardening her gaze. She was done holding back. Athena's heart pounded as she felt the sting of the slap radiate through her cheek, but she didn't allow herself even a second to process the pain. Her daughter, Isabella, was staring up at her with wide, terrified eyes, clutching her skateboard like a lifeline. In that moment, Athena knew she had to be strong, not just for herself, but for her daughter, who was watching her every move, learning from her reaction. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm, though her mind was racing. This wasn't the first time Athena had faced prejudice or even aggression, but it was the first time someone had dared to lay a hand on her so blatantly in public, without a hint of remorse. She knew men like Officer Copeland saw people like her as lesser, as if she didn't deserve the same respect as others. But to strike her, in front of her daughter, was a line she could not allow him to cross without consequence. Athena's instinct screamed at her to retaliate, but she was painfully aware of the power dynamics. Copeland wore a badge, and as a single black mother, she understood the dangers that came with standing up to authority figures who had no hesitation in abusing their power. But something inside her shifted as she looked at Isabella. Her daughter was watching, and Athena could not afford to let fear dictate her response. Athena straightened up, fixing her gaze on Copeland with a fierce determination that caught even him off guard. She saw a flicker of doubt cross his face, a hesitation as he realized she wasn't going to simply shrink away in submission. But before he could fully process it, Athena spoke, her voice steady and sharp, cutting through the tense silence between them. "You had no right to touch me," she said, her tone low but resolute. "I haven't done anything wrong, and you know it. Whatever authority you think you have doesn't give you the right to assault people. Not me, and not anyone." Copeland's face twisted into a sneer, his eyes narrowing as he looked at her. He wasn't accustomed to defiance, especially not from someone he viewed as beneath him. He stepped closer, his presence looming, and his voice was laced with condescension and barely disguised contempt. "Who do you think you are, talking to me like that?" he spat, looking her up and down as if she were something he'd found under his boot. "You should know your place. You think you can just waltz around here, acting like you own the place? You people are all the same, thinking the rules don't apply to you." Athena clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms as she fought to control her anger. She could feel Isabella's grip tightening on her arm, her daughter's silent plea for safety pulling her back from the edge. But she couldn't just let this go, not this time. Not with Isabella watching. This was her moment to show her daughter that they didn't have to accept being treated as less than anyone else. She took another step forward, closing the distance between her and Copeland. Her voice was calm, almost icy, and the unwavering confidence in her tone caught him off guard. "I don't care what you think of me," she said, each word deliberate, "but you will not touch me again. Not here, not anywhere, not in front of my daughter." Her words hung in the air, a bold challenge to the authority he so clearly believed he had over her. She could see the conflict flash across his face, the mix of anger and surprise as he processed her defiance. Copeland's grip on his own authority was slipping, and it was evident that he didn't know how to handle someone like her, someone who wasn't afraid to call him out. His face flushed with anger, and his voice dropped to a near growl. "You think you're brave, don't you? You think I won't put you in your place? Let me remind you that I'm the one in control here. I could arrest you right now if I wanted to." Athena held her ground, her gaze steady and unyielding. "You can try," she replied coolly, "but you'll regret it." Copeland's hand twitched, as if he were considering reaching for his handcuffs, but something about the way Athena stood, unwavering and unafraid, seemed to unnerve him. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like her. He glanced around, perhaps realizing that there were more people in the park now, that eyes were beginning to turn their way. He was no longer in control of the narrative, and the possibility of witnesses watching him lose control seemed to bring a hint of doubt into his otherwise arrogant demeanor. Athena sensed his hesitation, and it only strengthened her resolve. She took a small, controlled step back, just enough to give herself a bit more distance, but her eyes never left his. Her voice softened, not out of fear, but as a deliberate choice to show him that she was not afraid. "You can intimidate people all you want, Officer Copeland, but it won't work on me. I know my rights, and I know yours. What you did was assault, and there are consequences for that." Copeland's face darkened. He took a step forward, his jaw clenched, clearly not willing to let her have the last word. "Consequences," he laughed, though the sound was hollow. "For you, maybe. But don't think for a second that anyone's going to take your side over mine." Athena felt the familiar sting of those words, a reminder of the inequality that permeated her life and the lives of so many others. But instead of letting it dishearten her, it only fueled her determination. She was done allowing people like Copeland to dictate her life, to make her feel small, to teach her daughter that this was normal, that this was something they had to accept. Just then, a passerby, an older man with a grizzled beard and a weathered face, stopped nearby, watching the interaction with a look of concern. Athena saw him out of the corner of her eye, and a glimmer of hope flickered within her. She wasn't alone. She didn't need an army. She just needed one person, one witness who could see the truth of what was happening. Sensing his growing loss of control, Copeland's face twisted further in anger. He could feel his grip on the situation slipping, and it infuriated him. Without warning, he reached out, grabbing Athena's arm, his fingers digging into her skin. The suddenness of the motion startled her, and for a split second, her resolve wavered. But then, instinct took over. In a swift motion, Athena twisted her arm, breaking free from his grip with a move she hadn't practiced in years but remembered well. She took a step back, positioning herself between Copeland and Isabella, her stance steady and prepared. Her years of training in self-defense flooded back, every lesson she'd learned about protecting herself and those she loved. She had tried to keep things calm, to avoid escalation, but Copeland had forced her hand. He had crossed a line that she could no longer ignore. Copeland's face turned from arrogance to shock as he stumbled back, momentarily thrown off balance by her unexpected resistance. The passerby stepped closer, his eyes widening as he realized what was happening, and a few other people nearby started to watch more closely, their murmurs growing louder. "Let go of my mother." Isabella's voice cut through the tension, clear and strong, despite the fear in her eyes. She took a brave step forward, standing beside Athena, her small frame brimming with determination. Athena placed a protective arm around Isabella's shoulders, her gaze still locked on Copeland. Her voice was calm, but the underlying strength was unmistakable. "You have no right to touch us. If you so much as think about laying another hand on me or my daughter, I promise you, this will not end well for you." For a moment, Copeland's bravado faltered. He was used to people backing down, to them cowering in fear, especially when he resorted to force. But Athena was different. She didn't just stand her ground. She was ready to defend herself if necessary, and he could see that in her eyes. She was no ordinary woman. She was a mother, a protector, someone who had nothing to lose when it came to defending her family. The crowd around them continued to grow, and Copeland finally seemed to grasp that he was outmatched, not in strength, but in support. His jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides, but he could see that the situation was no longer in his favor. He took a step back, the anger still burning in his eyes, but there was a hint of something else now. Hesitation, maybe even fear. Athena watched him. Refusing to break eye contact, she had stood her ground, protected her daughter, and shown Copeland that he could not bully her into submission. She didn't need to raise her voice or fight back with aggression. Her strength came from her resolve, from her unshakable commitment to her daughter, and from her refusal to be intimidated. As Copeland turned and walked away, muttering under his breath, Athena finally allowed herself to breathe, pulling Isabella into a tight embrace. She whispered softly, "It's okay, baby. We're okay." But inside, she knew this was only the beginning. She had stood her ground today, but she also understood that standing up to someone like Copeland meant consequences, ones she was now prepared to face. The tension lingered in the air like a storm that hadn't fully passed, the echoes of Officer Copeland's retreating footsteps still faintly audible in the distance. Athena held Isabella close, feeling her daughter's small heart pounding through her jacket. She didn't loosen her protective grip until she was certain Copeland was gone. Finally, she let out a deep breath, looking down at Isabella, whose wide eyes reflected a mix of fear and awe. "Mom," Isabella whispered, her voice trembling but filled with admiration. "You weren't scared of him. You didn't let him push us around." Athena gave her daughter a reassuring smile, though the adrenaline still coursed through her own veins. She brushed a lock of Isabella's hair away from her face. "Baby, sometimes you have to stand up, no matter how scared you are inside. Nobody has the right to treat us like we're less than anyone else." Just as they began to turn away, intending to leave the park and put as much distance between themselves and the memory of Copeland as possible, a harsh voice shattered the brief moment of peace. "Well, look who thinks she's a hero." Athena's entire body went rigid, the blood draining from her face. She turned slowly, dread pooling in her stomach as she saw Copeland standing a few yards away, his hands clenched into fists. This time he wasn't alone. He had brought 2 other officers with him, both of them white men who wore the same smug, unyielding expressions that Copeland did. Reinforcements! Her mind spun, and she instinctively pulled Isabella closer, her fingers tightening around her daughter's hand. What do you want?" Athena's voice was calm, but inside, her thoughts raced, evaluating every possible scenario. She knew what this was. Copeland wasn't going to let her walk away unscathed after the embarrassment she had caused him. He was back for retribution, his bruised ego demanding to be restored, and now he had backup. One of the new officers, a younger man with close-cropped blonde hair, stepped forward. His eyes flicked over Athena and Isabella, his expression cold and calculating. "We got a report about a disturbance here," he said, his tone laced with accusation. "Apparently you assaulted an officer, Marma." Athena's mind reeled. Assaulted? He was twisting the truth, manipulating the situation to make her look like the aggressor. She had merely defended herself, yet she knew that her words alone wouldn't matter in the face of their united front. She could feel the weight of their combined authority pressing down on her, an oppressive force designed to make her question herself, to make her feel powerless. "I didn't assault anyone," Athena replied firmly, her voice resolute. "I only defended myself when he grabbed me. Your friend here is the one who crossed the line." Copeland's face darkened, his jaw clenching as he glared at her with undisguised hatred. "Watch your mouth," he snarled. "You're in enough trouble as it is. This park is full of families, decent people who don't want troublemakers like you disturbing the peace." Athena could feel the anger boiling inside her, a fiery determination not to back down in the face of his intimidation. But she was painfully aware of Isabella's presence, her daughter's small hand gripping her own with a strength that belied her age. She couldn't afford to lose control, not with Isabella watching, not with these men ready to pounce at the first sign of resistance. One of the officers, the older of the two reinforcements, gave Athena a slow, contemptuous look. "You've got a mouth on you, don't you?" he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Maybe it's time someone taught you a lesson in respect." Athena's stomach twisted. She could see where this was headed. They were trying to goad her into a reaction, something they could use as an excuse to escalate things further. She forced herself to take a steadying breath, focusing on the steady rhythm of her heart, grounding herself in the moment. "Respect is earned," Athena replied, her tone firm. "And none of you have earned mine today." The officer's eyes narrowed, his lip curling in a sneer. "You think you're tough, don't you? But we both know that it's just an act. People like you always think they're above the law." "People like me?" Athena repeated, feeling a surge of indignation. She knew exactly what he meant, but she wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of confirming it. Instead, she met his gaze unflinchingly. "I am not above the law. I respect the law, but only when it's fair." The younger officer took a step closer, crowding her personal space, his presence looming and oppressive. "You don't get to decide what's fair, ma'am," he said coldly. "That's for us to decide." Athena's hand tightened around Isabella's. Feeling her daughter's fingers interlace with her own, she could sense Isabella's fear, her daughter's silent plea for safety, and it only strengthened her resolve. "We're leaving," Athena said, her voice resolute. She began to turn, guiding Isabella with her. But before they could take more than a step, Copeland reached out, grabbing her arm in a vice-like grip. "I don't think so," he hissed, his face mere inches from hers, his eyes blazing with barely restrained fury. "You're coming with us." Athena pulled back, but his grip was unyielding, his fingers digging painfully into her skin. She could feel the anger rising within her, but she forced herself to remain calm, to focus on keeping herself and Isabella safe. "Let go of me," she demanded, her voice low and controlled. Copeland only tightened his grip, his expression darkening. "Or what? You gonna hit me again?" He laughed, the sound harsh and mocking, echoing in the empty space between them. Athena's gaze was steady as she looked him in the eyes, her voice unwavering. "You need to let go of me," she repeated, her tone icy. But Copeland wasn't listening. Instead, he signaled to the other two officers. "Cuff her," he ordered, his voice cold and merciless. "And make sure she doesn't give us any more trouble." The younger officer stepped forward, pulling out a pair of handcuffs with a metallic click that sent a shiver down Athena's spine. She knew what was coming, and she also knew that fighting back now would only give them the excuse they needed to use even more force. But she refused to show fear, even as they closed in around her, trapping her in a circle of authority and hostility. "Mom?" Isabella's voice was a frightened whisper, her small face pale as she clutched Athena's arm. Athena looked down, giving her daughter a reassuring smile, though her own heart hammered in her chest. "It's okay, baby," she said softly. "Stay calm, I'm here." But as the officer reached for her other arm, Athena's body tensed instinctively, every muscle in her body preparing to defend herself. She couldn't bear the thought of Isabella watching her be manhandled, of her daughter seeing her helpless and restrained. Her entire life had been a testament to resilience, to standing up against the odds, and she wasn't about to let that be taken away now. Just as the officer's hand closed around her wrist, Athena shifted her weight, moving with a fluidity that took him by surprise. In a quick, controlled motion, she twisted her arm, breaking free from his grip with practiced ease. The younger officer stumbled back, his eyes widening in shock as he realized that she wasn't as defenseless as he'd assumed. "Don't you dare touch me!" Athena warned, her voice a fierce whisper. Her eyes burned with a determination that was equal parts anger and defiance. Copeland's face twisted with rage, his control slipping as he saw her stand her ground once more. He lunged forward, aiming to grab her, but Athena sidestepped, her movements quick and precise. She knew she couldn't overpower them physically, but she could use her training to outmaneuver them to buy herself and Isabella enough time to get away. But the other officer recovered quickly, reaching for her again. This time, Athena anticipated his move, stepping back just as he lunged, causing him to stumble. She felt a surge of satisfaction at his momentary confusion, but she knew it wouldn't last. They would only grow more aggressive, more determined to break her spirit, the more she resisted. Isabella, who had been watching in silent horror, suddenly found her voice. "Leave my mom alone," she shouted, her small voice filled with a fierce protectiveness that mirrored her mother's. The officers ignored her, their focus solely on Athena. But hearing her daughter's voice gave Athena the strength she needed to continue. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for Isabella, for every lesson she'd ever taught her daughter about courage and dignity. She would not let these men rob her of that, no matter how much they tried to intimidate her. The older officer sneered, his face contorting with disdain. "Looks like we've got ourselves a fighter," he muttered, glancing at Copeland with a look of twisted amusement. "Maybe she needs a little reminder of who's in charge here." Copeland's eyes gleamed with Athena as he nodded, stepping forward. "Oh, I can handle that," he said, his voice dripping with anticipation. He raised his hand, as if preparing to strike her again, this time with more force. Athena braced herself, her gaze never wavering. She refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. She had faced worse in her life, endured hardships that had forged her into the woman she was today. She was not going to back down. Not now. Not ever. But just as Copeland's hand began to descend, a voice rang out from nearby, cutting through the tension like a blade. "Hey, what's going on here?" Athena turned her head, her heart lifting as she saw a man approaching a tall, imposing figure with a serious expression. He wore civilian clothes, but there was an air of authority about him that couldn't be mistaken. The officers paused, momentarily thrown off by the interruption. The man, who looked to be in his late 40s with a salt and pepper beard and a piercing gaze, stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the officers with a stern, unyielding stare. "I'm asking you a question," he said, his tone calm but firm. "What's going on here?" Copeland scowled, clearly annoyed by the man's presence, but he tried to maintain his composure. "Nothing to worry about, sir," he said dismissively, "just handling a disturbance." The man's gaze shifted to Athena and Isabella, his expression softening slightly as he took in their frightened but resolute faces. He looked back at Copeland, his eyes narrowing. "Doesn't look like anything to me," he said, his voice steady. "In fact, it looks like you're harassing this woman and her daughter." Copeland's jaw tightened, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Sir, I suggest you move along," he said, his tone sharp. "This is a police matter. The man didn't budge. "And I suggest you think carefully about your next move," he replied coolly. "Because I've seen enough to know that what you're doing here is wrong, and I'm not the only one watching." Copeland glanced around, realizing for the first time that a small crowd had gathered, watching the scene unfold with growing concern. He could feel his control slipping away, the power he'd wielded over Athena and Isabella fading as more people bore witness to his actions. Athena looked at the man, a glimmer of hope igniting within her. She didn't know who he was, but in that moment, he was a lifeline, a reminder that there were still people willing to stand up against injustice. She held Isabella close, feeling a sense of relief wash over her as the balance of power shifted in their favor, if only slightly. The man looked directly at Athena, giving her a small, reassuring nod, before turning his gaze back to the officers. "I'll be staying right here," he said firmly. "And if you try anything, you'll have to answer to me. And trust me, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what happened here." For the first time, Copeland hesitated, his hand lowering as he assessed the situation. He had come here for revenge, to assert his dominance. But now, with an audience and an unexpected ally on Athena's side, he found himself at a crossroads. The crowd that had gathered around Athena and Isabella grew denser, murmurs of disbelief and anger spreading among the onlookers as they realized the brutality unfolding before them. The man who had stepped in, now clearly more than just a concerned passerby, stood his ground with unwavering confidence, his steely gaze fixed on Officer Copeland. His presence was a barrier between the officers and Athena, a silent but powerful reminder that abuse of power would not go unnoticed. The man introduced himself with a calm, authoritative tone. "Name's Elijah Owens," he said, his eyes narrowing as he glanced from Copeland to the two officers flanking him. "Civil rights attorney. I know exactly what your duties are, officers, and I can tell you that none of what I'm seeing falls within your mandate to serve and protect." Copeland's face twisted with irritation and barely suppressed rage. Elijah Owens was a name he recognized, one that had been mentioned around the station with a mixture of contempt and fear. Owens was known for taking on cases against police misconduct, a man with a reputation for dismantling officers' defenses with a relentless pursuit of justice. The last thing Copeland needed was to have someone like him witnessing his actions firsthand. But Copeland's ego and wounded pride wouldn't let him back down easily. He clenched his jaw, trying to maintain an air of authority. "This woman assaulted an officer," he spat, pointing at Athena with an accusatory finger. "I have every right to detain her and ensure public safety." Owens didn't flinch. Instead, he raised an eyebrow, his gaze cool and unperturbed. "I've been watching for a few minutes now, and I haven't seen anything that warrants public safety measures. What I have seen," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd, "is a gross misuse of power, intimidation, and excessive force." The other officers shifted uncomfortably, their initial confidence waning, as they realized they were up against someone who wouldn't be easily silenced. Athena felt a surge of gratitude toward Owens, his presence like a shield between her and the men who had tried to strip her of her dignity. She straightened, gathering strength from the attorney's firm stance and from the unwavering support she felt emanating from the crowd. Yet she knew Copeland wasn't done. His anger simmered, barely restrained as he glanced at the watching faces around him, realizing that his authority was slipping with every passing second. But rather than accept defeat, he chose to double down, his face reddening as he turned his fury back on Athena. "You think bringing in a lawyer is going to save you?" he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're just another troublemaker looking for attention, and you're dragging this whole crowd into your mess. Let me make one thing clear. None of this changes the fact that you resisted an officer and assaulted me." Athena felt her temper flare, the injustice of his words like salt in an open wound. She wanted to shout, to tell everyone the truth of what had happened, but Owens put a calming hand on her shoulder, grounding her. He looked her in the eyes, a silent message passing between them. "Trust me. Let me handle this." Owens stepped forward, his expression hardening as he addressed Copeland directly. "Officer Copeland, I suggest you consider the consequences of fabricating charges. I'll remind you that we have witnesses here, plenty of people who saw exactly what you did. You laid hands on an unarmed woman, a mother, without cause. And now you are attempting to intimidate her into silence. One of the other officers, the younger one who had seemed more hesitant from the beginning, shifted uncomfortably, glancing nervously between Owens and Copeland. For a brief moment he seemed to realize the precariousness of their position. Maybe we should back off, Copeland, he mumbled, clearly reluctant to confront someone like Owens, especially in front of a crowd. But Copeland shot him a glare, silencing his doubts. Don't be an idiot, he hissed. You think we're just going to let her walk away after she attacked me? He turned back to Athena, his eyes narrowing with a vindictive gleam. People like her need to learn that there are consequences for crossing the line. Owens's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. And what exactly is the line, Officer Copeland? She was standing up for herself, refusing to be intimidated. If that's crossing the line in your book, then perhaps the problem isn't with her, but with you. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, their support for Athena, and anger toward the officer swelling. A few people began to call out, their voices rising in protest. "Leave her alone!" shouted a woman from the back, her face twisted in anger. "We saw what you did. She didn't do anything wrong." Another man, older and with a walking cane, shook his head in disgust. "This is what's wrong with the system," he muttered, his voice loud enough for the officers to hear. "They think they can get away with anything just because they wear a badge." Copeland's face flushed with embarrassment, his composure cracking as the crowd continued to turn against him. He took a step back, momentarily thrown off balance by the outpouring of support for Athena, but instead of backing down, he gritted his teeth, clinging to his authority as a last desperate measure. "That's enough," he barked, his voice carrying over the crowd. "Everyone needs to disperse immediately, or you'll be interfering with police business." Owen shook his head slowly, his voice dropping to a steely whisper that only Copeland and the other officers could hear. "You're digging your own grave, officer. The more you push, the worse it's going to be for you." Ignoring Owen, Copeland reached for his radio, signaling for additional backup, determined to reassert his control by any means necessary. But just as he was about to call in the reinforcements, a hand grabbed his wrist, stopping him. It was the younger officer, the one who had looked uncertain from the start. He met Copeland's gaze with a mixture of defiance and fear. "This has gone too far," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "We can't keep escalating. Look around, Copeland. This isn't right. And you know it." Copeland stared at him, stunned, and for a moment his expression softened, as if he might reconsider. But then his pride flared up again, the humiliation of being challenged in public too much for him to bear. He jerked his hand free from the younger officer's grip, his face contorted with rage. "Don't tell me what's right," he snapped. "I've been doing this job longer than you've been alive, and I don't need a lecture on how to handle a criminal." He turned back to Athena, his eyes blazing with a renewed determination to break her spirit, to make an example of her. But as he took a step toward her, Owens positioned himself directly in his path, his stance unyielding. "I'm warning you, Officer Copeland," he said, his voice deadly calm. "If you take another step, I will see to it personally that you face charges. You're not dealing with a defenseless woman anymore. You're dealing with me, and I assure you, I don't back down." For the first time, true fear flickered in Copeland's eyes. He looked at Owens, weighing his options, torn between his need to assert his authority and the realization that he might have finally met someone he couldn't intimidate. The tension was palpable, the air thick with anticipation as the crowd watched, holding their breath. Isabella clung to her mother's side, her small hand clutching Athena's tightly, her young face a mixture of fear and pride as she looked up at her mother. Athena felt her heart swell, her own fear dissolving in the face of her daughter's bravery. But just as Copeland seemed to waver, one of the spectators pulled out a smartphone, raising it high and aiming it directly at him. The sight of the phone seemed to be the breaking point for Copeland, the final crack in his armor of arrogance and authority. His face drained of color, and he stepped back, finally realizing that the situation was spiraling beyond his control. "Fine," he muttered, his voice barely audible, his gaze dropping to the ground. "Fine. But don't think this is over." Owens didn't respond, his steady gaze fixed on Copeland until the officer turned and began to retreat, his two fellow officers reluctantly following. The crowd erupted in relief, voices cheering and applauding Athena's bravery, their energy a palpable force that filled the air. Athena released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her body relaxing as the weight of the confrontation finally lifted. She knelt down, pulling Sarah into a tight embrace, whispering soothing words as her daughter clung to her, the tension of the ordeal releasing in quiet sobs. Owens placed a hand on Athena's shoulder, his expression one of respect and admiration. "You did well," he said softly. "You stood your ground, and you didn't let him win. That's something your daughter will remember for the rest of her life." Athena looked up at him, gratitude shining in her eyes. "Thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in." Owens nodded, his face softening. Sometimes all it takes is one person to make a difference. But make no mistake, this fight isn't over. Men like Copeland don't let things go easily. If you're willing, I'd like to help you take this further and make sure he's held accountable. Athena hesitated, the weight of his offer sinking in. She had always known that standing up to people like Copeland came with risks. But as she looked at Sarah's tear-streaked face and saw the pride and love in her daughter's eyes, she knew she couldn't let this go unanswered. "Let's do it," she said firmly, her voice filled with resolve. "Not just for me, but for everyone who's ever been through something like this." Owen smiled, a glimmer of satisfaction in his eyes. "I'll make the calls. We're going to make sure he thinks twice before he ever tries something like this again." After they turned to leave, the crowd parting to let them pass, their faces filled with admiration and respect. As they walked away, hand in hand, Athena felt a sense of triumph mixed with a renewed purpose. She had stood her ground, fought for her dignity, and shown her daughter that fear would not define them. But she also knew that this was only the beginning. Owen's retreat was temporary, a wound to his pride that would fester. Yet now, with Owens by her side and her own strength reaffirmed, she was ready to face whatever came next. She would protect her family and her community and ensure that no one else would have to endure what they had gone through. As they disappeared into the evening, the embers of their defiance continued to burn, a quiet promise of change that would echo far beyond this one moment. Athena and Isabella walked home that evening with a newfound sense of strength, the warmth of Owen's support lingering in Athena's heart like a protective shield. She knew they had won a small battle in the park, but as she looked at Isabella, still clutching her hand tightly, she also knew that the fight was far from over. The confrontation with Officer Copeland had shaken her, but it had also awakened something deep inside of her. Fierce, unyielding resolve to stand up against the forces that tried to intimidate and belittle her. It was a determination not only for her own dignity, but for the safety and pride of her daughter. The next morning, Athena was preparing breakfast when she heard a knock at the door. Her heart leapt with anxiety. She rarely had visitors, and after what had happened yesterday, every unexpected noise felt like a warning, a premonition of something darker lurking on the horizon. She gently told Isabella to stay in the kitchen, her tone casual but firm, and walked to the door. Opening it, she was surprised to find Elijah Owen standing on her doorstep, looking composed yet concerned. He was holding a folder and had the intense focus of someone who had already planned his next move. "Good morning, Athena," he greeted, his voice calm, but carrying an underlying seriousness. "I didn't mean to surprise you by coming here unannounced, but after what happened yesterday, I wanted to make sure you were all right, and I wanted to discuss some things I think you should be aware of." Athena let him in, offering him a seat in her small living room. They sat across from each other, and Owens opened the folder, revealing pages filled with reports, statements, and official-looking documents. He handed her a piece of paper detailing the police department's recent complaints and allegations, specifically pointing to misconduct by Officer Copeland. "These are official complaints filed against Copeland over the years," Owens explained, his tone serious. "Your case is not the first. He has a history of abuse, and yet each complaint somehow vanished into thin air. The system has protected him time and time again. Athena skimmed through the papers, her hands shaking as she read about people who had faced similar brutality, intimidation, and false accusations. She felt a surge of anger as she recognized the familiar patterns. Innocent people harassed, lives disrupted, all because Copeland and others like him felt untouchable. Her anger turned to determination as she met Owens's gaze. "So what are we going to do?" she asked, her voice laced with a newfound resolve. Owens leaned forward, his expression intense. "I want to make this public. We need to get your story out there. I know a few trusted reporters who would be interested in exposing Copeland's history, and we can pressure the department to take action." "But Athena," he paused, looking at her with concern. "This won't be easy. Once we go down this path, Copeland and his supporters won't back down. They'll do everything they can to discredit you, to make you look like the aggressor." Athena took a deep breath, glancing back toward the kitchen where Isabella was busy coloring at the table. "I understand the risks," she said, her voice unwavering. "But I can't let him get away with this. Not anymore." Owens nodded, respect gleaming in his eyes. "Then let's get to work." The next few days were a whirlwind of interviews, meetings, and preparations. Owens arranged for Athena to meet with a journalist from a reputable publication known for its investigative work on police misconduct. Athena poured her heart out, recounting the traumatic encounter in the park and the terror she had felt for her daughter. She spoke not only about her experience, but also about the countless other families affected by officers like Copeland. The article was published a week later titled, "When Those Who Swore to Protect Become the Threat." It detailed Athena's story alongside testimonies from other victims who had encountered Copeland. The article went viral within hours, igniting outrage and sparking calls for action. Social media erupted with hashtags demanding justice, and the police department found itself under intense scrutiny as the public called for an investigation into Copeland's actions. But Athena knew this exposure would provoke a response, and not a friendly one. That night, as she was tucking Isabella into bed, her phone vibrated with a notification. It was a text message from an unknown number. "You think you're a hero? This isn't over. You have no idea what you've started." Her blood ran cold. She didn't need to guess who it was. The veiled threat was all too familiar, and she knew it was Copeland trying to intimidate her into silence. She deleted the message, not wanting Isabella to see, but the threat lingered in her mind, seeping into her thoughts like a dark, heavy fog. She sat in the living room, alone, trying to steady her breathing, her hands trembling as she clutched her phone. The next morning, Athena found a police car parked across the street from her house. She could feel the officers' eyes on her as she left to take Isabella to school, their stares a silent reminder that they were watching her every move. She tried to act nonchalant for Isabella's sake, but inside, her anxiety churned, a constant hum that wouldn't let her rest. At work, she noticed the same pattern. Officers would occasionally pass by the store where she worked, casting pointed glances through the windows, their presence heavy and unsettling. They were trying to break her, to make her feel isolated, but Athena held firm, reminding herself of the support she had and the justice she was fighting for. Later that day, she received a call from Owens. His voice was calm, but there was a tension there that she hadn't heard before. "Athena, I just received a tip from one of my contacts at the department. Apparently, there's been talk of revisiting your record. They're trying to dig up anything they can use against you, any past incident, no matter how minor, to make you look like the problem." Athena clenched her jaw, anger sparking in her chest. "They're trying to discredit me." "Yes," Owens replied. "It's a common tactic. They're hoping to make the public question your credibility, to shift the narrative in their favor. But I want you to know that we're prepared for this. I'll do everything in my power to protect you legally. And there are people who believe in you, people who will stand by you no matter what." Athena took a deep breath, her mind racing as she processed his words. "Thank you, Elijah. I'm not backing down. I just need to know that Isabella will be safe through all of this." "She will be," Owens assured her. "I promise you we're in this together." As the weeks passed, the tension only grew. Athena became a symbol of resilience and courage, her story resonating with people across the city and beyond. But with her growing visibility came escalating threats. She received anonymous calls late at night, messages that veiled threats in polite words, and even strange cars parked outside her house for hours. The intimidation tactics were relentless, a constant reminder that Copeland and his supporters were willing to go to any lengths to protect their power. One evening, as Athena was closing up the store where she worked, she heard footsteps approaching from behind. Her pulse quickened, and she turned to find Copeland standing there, his face twisted in a smug smile. Her body went rigid, and every muscle tensed as she prepared herself for whatever was coming. "You just couldn't let it go, could you?" he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think you're some kind of hero stirring up trouble, but I'm warning you, Athena, this isn't going to end well for you." Athena's eyes narrowed, her fear quickly transforming into anger. "You don't scare me, Copeland. You're nothing more than a bully hiding behind a badge, and I'm not going to let you or anyone else intimidate me." His smile faltered, replaced by a flash of rage. He stepped closer, invading her personal space, his face inches from hers. "You think you're brave? You're just a pawn in a game you don't understand. People like me, we're untouchable. You can scream and cry all you want, but in the end, I'll still be here. And you'll be nothing but a cautionary tale." Athena held her ground, refusing to let him see her fear. "We'll see about that. People like you always think you're invincible until you're not." He chuckled, a hollow, menacing sound that echoed in the empty store. "Keep dreaming. But don't say I didn't warn you." With that, he turned and walked out, leaving Athena standing there, her hands clenched into fists, her mind swirling with a mixture of anger, fear, and defiance. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, that Copeland wouldn't stop until he'd tried everything to destroy her, but she also knew she wasn't alone. The next day, Owens called with an update. "The public pressure is building, Athena. The department has announced they're opening an investigation into Copeland. This is huge. It's the first real step toward holding him accountable." Athena felt a surge of relief, a glimmer of hope breaking through the darkness, but Owens's tone was cautious. "Don't let your guard down. Copeland and his allies won't take this lightly. They're likely to retaliate, to try and make this as difficult as possible for you." Athena nodded, her determination stealing. "I understand. I'm ready for whatever comes next." Over the following weeks, Athena's resolve was tested like never before. She endured slander, intimidation, and even subtle threats against her family, each tactic designed to erode her strength and make her question her fight for justice. But every time she felt her courage wavering, she thought of Isabella, of the world she wanted her daughter to grow up in, a world where people like Copeland didn't get to abuse their power without consequences. Finally, the day arrived when Athena was called to testify as part of the investigation into Copeland's actions. She walked into the courthouse with her head held high, feeling the weight of every person who had supported her, of every voice that had called for justice alongside her. As she took the stand, she looked over at Copeland, who sat across the room, his expression a mixture of anger and fear. For the first time, he seemed small, diminished in the face of the truth that was about to be revealed. Athena took a deep breath, her heart pounding with both fear and anticipation. "I am here today," she began, her voice steady because I refused to be silenced. "I am here not just for myself, but for every person who has ever faced injustice, who has ever been told that they don't matter. This is our fight, and we will not back down." The courtroom fell silent, every eye fixed on Athena as she spoke. In that moment, she was more than just a victim. She was a symbol of courage, a beacon of hope for everyone who had ever been afraid to stand up for themselves. As she left the courthouse later that day, with Isabella by her side, she knew the fight was far from over. But she also knew that she had made a difference, that she had shown her daughter and the world that sometimes standing up was the only way forward. And as they walked away, hand in hand, Athena felt a quiet, unbreakable strength within her, a promise that, no matter what came next, she would keep fighting for the justice they all deserved, The day of the hearing had finally arrived, casting a tense silence over the courtroom as people took their seats, murmuring in anticipation. Athena sat at the front, her gaze steady, her heart pounding with a mixture of anxiety and defiance. She had waited for this moment, for the chance to finally speak the truth without fear, to confront Officer Copeland in front of everyone. Beside her sat Elijah Owens, her steadfast eye, a silent force of reassurance. Behind her, a wave of community members filled the room. Friends, neighbors, and strangers who had been touched by her story and had come to show their support. At the opposite side of the room sat Officer Copeland, his face tense and flushed, his attorney leaning close, whispering hurried words. Athena could see the unease etched in his features. He wasn't the towering figure he had been in the park, where his authority had granted him a sense of untouchability. Here, stripped of his badge and the comfort of his uniform, he looked small, almost cornered, knowing that the power he had once used so freely was slipping out of his grasp. The judge called the court to order, and as the room fell silent, Athena felt her pulse quicken. The weight of this moment pressed on her, but she took a deep breath, grounding herself in the faces of those who believed in her, especially her daughter Isabella, who was seated behind her, her young eyes wide with admiration and hope. As the proceedings began, Officer Copeland's attorney attempted to paint a picture of a dutiful officer who had been provoked into action. They recounted a twisted version of events, one in which Athena had aggressively resisted a simple request where her hostile attitude had supposedly justified his actions. Athena's anger simmered as she listened to the lies, feeling the familiar sting of frustration that came with knowing how easily authority could distort the truth. But this time she wasn't alone, and she wasn't helpless. Owens rose from his seat, his calm, assured demeanor a direct contrast to Copeland's agitated lawyer. He began to methodically dismantle their claims, highlighting inconsistencies in Copeland's story, calling attention to witness statements and evidence that contradicted the officer's account. Bit by bit, he exposed the falseness of Copeland's defense, his voice measured and unwavering, each point driving home the undeniable truth of what had happened that day in the park. Finally, it was Athena's turn to take the stand. She felt a wave of nerves rise within her as she walked to the front, facing the judge and jury, her heart pounding with the gravity of what she was about to say. She took a deep breath, focusing on Isabella's face in the audience, her daughter's gaze giving her the strength she needed. "I came here today," she began, her voice clear but filled with emotion, "because I want justice not just for myself, but for everyone who has ever been made to feel small, to feel powerless in the face of someone who abuses their authority." Her voice grew steadier as she recounted the events of that day, describing the fear and humiliation she had felt as Copeland had accosted her in front of her daughter. She spoke of the moment he struck her, the pain and anger that had surged within her, and how she had stood her ground, not out of disrespect, but out of a deep need to protect herself and her child. "I knew that if I didn't stand up then," she said, glancing at the jury, "I would be teaching my daughter that it's okay to let people treat us as less than human. That's not a lesson I ever want her to learn." The courtroom was silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Athena glanced briefly at Copeland, noting the tightness of his expression, the way he avoided her gaze. The bravado that had marked his demeanor in the park was gone, replaced by an unmistakable sense of vulnerability. For the first time she saw him as he was, a man stripped of his power, facing the consequences of his actions. When she finished, she took her seat, feeling the collective strength of everyone around her, their silent support bolstering her resolve. The final testimony was a powerful moment that shifted the tide even further in Athena's favor. One by one, witnesses came forward, recounting their own experiences with Officer Copeland, describing similar incidents of intimidation, aggression, and blatant abuse of power. A former colleague of Copeland's testified, reluctantly admitting to witnessing incidents of misconduct but feeling powerless to speak up in the past. The stories painted a damning portrait of a man who had long considered himself above the law, a man who had grown comfortable in a role that allowed him to wield power without accountability, By the end of the day, it was clear that the case had taken a decisive turn. The evidence was undeniable, and the stories of Copeland's past behavior were too consistent to ignore. As the judge delivered the final instructions to the jury, Athena felt a sense of peace settle over her, the weight of the past few weeks lifting, replaced by a quiet, fierce hope. The jury deliberated for hours, the tension in the courtroom thick as they waited for the verdict. Athena sat with Owen, Isabella by her side, both of them holding her hands, their presence grounding her, a reminder of the strength she had found not only in herself, but in those who believed in her. Finally, the jury returned, their faces solemn but determined. Athena held her breath as the foreperson rose, delivering the verdict with a clear, steady voice. Guilty. The word echoed in the courtroom, a single syllable that seemed to reverberate with the weight of justice, finally being served. Relief washed over Athena, a flood of emotions overwhelming her as she realized that she had won. She had stood up, faced her fear, and emerged victorious, proving not only to herself, but to everyone watching that truth, and resilience could indeed prevail. As the room erupted into murmurs, Owen leaned over, his voice filled with pride. You did it, Athena. You didn't just stand up for yourself. You stood up for everyone who's ever been silenced. Athena turned to him, her eyes filled with gratitude. I couldn't have done it without you, without everyone who believed in me. She looked at Isabella, who was beaming, her face shining with pride and love. As they left the courthouse, a crowd had gathered outside, a sea of faces filled with admiration, their cheers and applause filling the air. Athena felt a surge of gratitude, her heart swelling as she realized the impact of her journey. She had become more than a symbol of resistance. She was a beacon of hope for those who had been voiceless, a reminder that courage could indeed change lives. She knelt down, pulling Isabella into a tight embrace, whispering softly, Remember this moment, Scott. Remember that no matter how hard things get, you're never alone. There's always strength in standing up for what's right. Isabella hugged her back, her small arms wrapped around her mother, with a fierce love that transcended words. I'm so proud of you, Mom, she whispered. You're the bravest person I know. Athena stood, taking a moment to soak in the support of the people around her, the warmth of their gratitude like a balm over every scar that had been left by the past few weeks. She took Owen's hand, a silent promise passing between them that they would continue the fight, that they would work to dismantle the systems that allowed people like Copeland to abuse their power unchecked. As they walked away from the courthouse, surrounded by supporters, Athena felt a new sense of purpose take root within her. This victory was only the beginning. She knew there were others out there, people who had been silenced, who needed the same support she had received. She was ready to be that support, to continue fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. And as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting a warm glow over the courthouse steps, Athena felt an unbreakable strength rise within her. She had faced her greatest fears. She had confronted the injustice that had tried to consume her, and she had emerged victorious, a testament to the power of resilience, love, and unwavering courage. In the days following the trial, the atmosphere in Athena's neighborhood was transformed. People approached her on the street, expressing gratitude and admiration. She had become a symbol of resilience, her story spreading far beyond their community. Athena felt humbled by the support and newfound respect, but she was also acutely aware of the weight it placed on her. She had stood up to injustice, yes, but now people saw her as a beacon for change. It was a responsibility she didn't take lightly. The morning after the verdict, she sat with Isabella at their small kitchen table, sharing a quiet breakfast. For the first time in what felt like ages, there was peace in their home. Isabella, who had been so strong and brave through everything, looked up at her mother with a sense of wonder. "Mom," she said softly, "does this mean we won't have to be scared anymore?" Athena reached across the table, taking her daughter's small hand in hers. "It means that we stood up for ourselves, sweetheart, and we made a difference. But it also means that there's more work to do, so that no one else has to go through what we did." Isabella nodded, her young face serious. She understood more than Athena had realized. "So we keep standing up." Athena smiled, pride swelling in her chest. "Yes, we keep standing up. Not just for us, but for everyone who needs it." As the day unfolded, Athena received a call from Elijah Owens. He congratulated her again, and then shared an idea that had been on his mind. "Athena, you're a voice people need. I'm getting calls from others who've had similar experiences, and they're looking to you for hope. Have you thought about starting a foundation, something that will continue this work?" Athena considered the idea, excitement stirring within her. A foundation, a place where others could find the support and courage they needed, just as she had. She thought of all the people who had reached out, all those who had suffered in silence. This could be a way to help them, a way to ensure that her victory didn't end with her own case. "Let's do it," she replied, determined to strengthen her voice. "Let's give them a place where they feel safe, where they can stand up like I did." Over the next few months, Athena and Owens worked tirelessly, bringing the foundation to life. They named it Voices Unbroken, a symbol of resilience and the strength to rise above adversity. Their mission was simple, but profound: to provide legal, emotional, and community support for victims of injustice and abuse of authority. The foundation grew quickly, thanks to the momentum from Athena's case. Donations poured in, volunteers stepped forward, and the community rallied around them. Athena threw herself into the work with passion, using her own experience as a guiding light. She spoke at events, shared her story, and encouraged others to come forward, reminding them that they were not alone, that their voices mattered. One afternoon, as Athena sat in her new office at the foundation, she received a message that brought her back to that fateful day in the park. It was from a young woman who had been harassed by an officer, but hadn't known how to fight back. She wrote to Athena saying, "I thought I didn't have the strength, but watching you showed me that I do. Thank you for helping me find my voice." Reading those words, Athena felt a sense of purpose so strong, it nearly brought tears to her eyes. She had not only reclaimed her own dignity, but had helped others do the same. She knew that there would always be battles to fight, and there would always be those who tried to silence voices like hers. But she also knew now, more than ever, that the power of standing together could overcome even the strongest barriers. On the foundation's opening day, Athena took the stage, addressing a crowd of supporters, community members, and families who had come to celebrate. She looked out over the faces, each one filled with hope, and began to speak. Voices Unbroken exists because no one deserves to feel powerless. We all deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. When one of us is hurt, we all feel that pain, and when one of us stands up, we all grow stronger. The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing the sentiment that had brought them all together. In that moment, Athena felt an overwhelming sense of unity, a bond forged by shared struggle and collective resilience. After the event, Isabella ran up to her mother, wrapping her arms around her waist, her eyes shining with pride. "Mom, you did it. You really did it." Athena hugged her daughter tightly, a soft smile on her face. "We did it, Isabella, and we're going to keep doing it." As they left the building hand in hand, Athena looked out at the city, her heart full of hope. She knew there would be more challenges, more fights to come. But now, she also knew that she would never face them alone. She had a community, a voice, and a purpose that would carry her forward no matter what lay ahead. Her journey had started with fear and pain, but it had transformed into something beautiful, a testament to the power of resilience, the strength of standing together, and the unbreakable spirit that could turn even the darkest moments into a source of light.